Because our infants didn't arrive with an instruction booklet, how we treat them is always cause for concern. Are we doing the right thing? Thanks to breakthroughs in neuroscience, we now have a much better idea what the wrong things are, because they activate a body chemical called cortisol, which in big doses becomes toxic and may impede brain development. I'll explain more of this shortly. It has also given us a great insight as to why we are the way we are, because after all, we were infants once too. Let me try to make this a bit clearer. Prior to the breakthroughs in neuroscience, it was fairly well known that the cause of certain stresses and fears could be traced back to traumatic experiences in our lives. So, for example, if someone had been raped in a dark alley some 40 years earlier and not worked through the trauma, they would still be terrified of dark alleys. Seeing a counselor and working through such experiences would help diminish the trauma and take away the terror of dark alleys. The mystery, though, was why so many people suffered from depression, anxiety, neediness, feelings of rejection and abandonment, dependency on others, etc., when there was no memorable trauma to link these conditions to. Obviously something had happened, but what? Theories to explain this had been around for over 60 years, but what was needed was scientific proof. When the MRI scanner was developed, scientists were able to see what was going on inside people's brains. It came as quite a shock to researchers when they took the scans of severely mentally and emotionally abused children who had grown up without love. In the brain on the left, the black areas are parts that have never developed. This is not physical damage. Someone didn't beat this person's head in to cause this. It was caused by feelings of rejection and abandonment, a lack of love and care. It's from severe mental and emotional abuse. You can see the difference between a healthy brain and a damaged one. Cortisol would have been the main culprit for the damage done to the one on the left. Interestingly, this cortisol can be measured by taking a swab of saliva and processing it. Look at the black line on the graph. This is someone who has too much cortisol in their system. Scientists then measured the cortisol levels on an infant when he was distressed, and the levels were right up at the top too. But, and this is the fascinating part, the levels weren't up there for any apparent good reason. The infant hadn't been beaten. All that had happened was that his mother wasn't around to comfort him. Because babies' brains aren't yet wired to think, he believes he has been abandoned, his sole hope of survival gone. Anyone who has lost a loved one knows what this abandonment feels like. Only babies don't have the brain wiring to cope with it. Consequently, his cortisol level rockets, and if his mom or caregiver doesn't respond and return to comfort him, his cortisol level will increase and increase until it gets like a washing machine that can't be turned off. Unless he is lovingly attended to, the toxic effect of the cortisol reaches a point where he can no longer cope with the stress of such parental behavior and will likely go into meltdown. To believe he will cease to exist, an absolutely terrifying experience with lifelong consequences. Such experiences are then refiled in the unconscious mind, but continue to help create anxiety, depression, neediness, feelings of rejection and abandonment, dependency on others, rage, no motivation, low self-esteem, and uncaring, that is, to be unaware of the plight of others, when he grows up. All of which I think you would agree we could do without. The more we have experienced these extremely traumatic incidents as babies, the more of the above we are likely to have. Naturally, intentional neglect and abuse will impact on us far worse and may lead to severe mental illness. The excess cortisol can also cause reduced brain growth and cell death, damage to memory storing cells, damage to the infant's immune system, psychosomatic illnesses, and traumatic disruption of all sorts of developing systems in an infant's body and brain. As I said, the problem is that babies' brains are not yet wired to think. When his mom leaves him, he cannot think or self-soothe himself like, "Oh, she'll be back soon." He just can't do that. You can see here how the connections are increasing as the infant gets older. It is these connections that allow the reasoning process. But even at the age of 2, the connections are still totally inadequate. An adult has millions more of these connections to help them through what they are experiencing when stressed. It is because of these inadequate connections that infants can't self-soothe. And because of this, the cortisol level rockets when he is stressed. Ultimately, toxic cortisol prevents certain connections from welding, which then affects us for the rest of our lives, unless we choose to do something about it. So what do we need to